Hey everyone, I'm your host Brittany Jones Cooper, and welcome to Build Series. Racism is woven into the fabric of America. It impacts our politics, entertainment, and relationships. Still, it's a topic many people try to avoid talking about. In their new book, Stamped Racism, Antiracism, and You, best-selling and award-winning authors Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi shine a light on racism and empower readers to identify and stamp out racist ideas in their everyday lives. Jason and Ibram, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, thank you.
How you doing?
Good.
We're good, yeah.
Yeah.
Your voice went up when you said good.
I know, because I'm tired. And so I'm like, there's probably a little bit of like, oh yeah, I'm good. And then I'm like, I'm just tired.
You're like, it will be better if I get to sleep 8 to 10 hours.
No, we're good.
So I really fanned out over you guys in the back because I read this book very quickly. I think it is so important and it is so accessible, which is why I know that's why it is in existence, is because it really takes these very complex, deeply woven into the fabric of America issues and really simplifies them. So just thank you, first of all, because I really do intend to share this with people in my life in hopes that it will kind of help us to have a more constructive conversation. So I do want to start with you. You wrote the original version of the book.
Stamp Senior.
Yeah.
Stamp Senior.
In 2016, you were a National Book Award winner. It was a huge success. So why did you want to create this version of the book?
Well, when I went out sort of speaking about that book, so many people were like, I wish I learned this information when I was in high school. Or they would say, this book should be in every middle school, every high school in America. And if it did, it would transform this country. And so people just kept telling me this over and over again. And so I realized, you know what, let's create that type of book. Let's create a young adult version of Stamp from the beginning.
Was there a theme or a topic or vocabulary word or something from the original version of the book that people kept coming to you and wanting to talk to you about?
I think every single sort of person experienced the book differently because there's so many different racist ideas that target different groups of people. And so it really sort of depended on the type of person. So if it was a black woman, she could really see herself being the ideas that have been targeting her over time. She could see how that was affecting her, or a black poor person, the same thing.
Yeah. So take me through finding Jason and why he was somebody you wanted to have write the remix.
So we met at the National Book Awards sort of ceremony in 2016. And, I was captivated by meeting him personally, and then I got to know his work. Then I got to know his story in terms of he's really sort of on a mission to ensure that we don't blame kids who don't read. We blame the books, and we transform the books. And then I also saw how he had, through his own novels, was able to take extremely complex conversations about race and racism and larger sort of topics and make it accessible and cool for everyday, young people. And so when we were thinking again about who to sort of do this book, I thought he'd be the perfect person. So then I asked him, and then he said no.
Right.
Yeah.
I read that. Why'd you say no, Jason?
Wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge responsibility.
Exactly. There you go, right? It's a huge responsibility. I think everyone, what it really is I think that sometimes writers think that because they can write something, they can write everything. And I just know that to be false. And so I was slow to say yes because I respected the work. I respected the sanctity of the work and the magnitude of the work. And I wasn't quite sure that I would be able to carry the load. And it's not the kind of thing you want to mess up, right? And so it took some coaxing, but once he asked and he asked and he asked, and eventually I said yes, because I think there's also a moment where you realize, let me take my own insecurity and my own ego out of it for a moment and step out of the way and say, well, what if this is bigger than the both of us? What if we can actually do something to serve our youth that might potentially change the world in the next 10 years?
And you did an amazing job. You write young adult novels and you have that kind of audience down. But I want to emphasize that I think this is good for any adult as well. Sure. It's such a necessary education. But what conversations did you guys have about the tone of Stamped and how you wanted to approach these topics? Because there are points where it's funny and light, and then points where it's obviously very serious.
Yeah, I think, I give one thing I'll say about Ibram is he just let me do my thing. And not just Ibram and also our editor, Lisa, who doesn't get enough credit, who also just kind of let me rock. You know, the hard part was convincing me to do my thing. But there were some non-negotiables we talked about, sort of the things that Ibram wanted to make sure were in the book. There are certain things that could not be missed, right? And so I abide by those rules. And the rest of it was sort of like, all right, well, let me stretch out and see if I can tap into whatever if I can trust myself enough to do the thing that I've been doing for so long.
Was one of those things the different categories of racism that exist, whether it's segregationist, assimilationist, and then the anti-racist? Can you take us through those words and why they're important to impress upon people?
Yeah, I think that was one of the sort of non-negotiables, and I also thought that it was absolutely critical for this new book to even translate those terms, you know, and so, you know, it was just fascinating how, you know, Jason was able to sort of translate the term segregationist into basically like a hater, like, you know, somebody who hates you because you're different from them and thinks of you as inferior because you're different from them. And then he took the term assimilationist and translated that to a liker, which is somebody who likes you the more you're like them. Mm-hmm. And so they're looking, they view you currently as inferior, and the more you look like them and act like them, the more and better you look to them. And then finally, the anti-racist became the lover, which are essentially people who love you, for being different, for being yourself. And so, you know, I think there's so many ways in which this sort of book was simultaneously transformed, but then simultaneously sort of stayed true to the original. And I think that's what was so fascinating, you know, about this new book.
Yeah. And those three words, it was the first time I had read them, is in this version of the book. And it helped me go back through history and then just better categorize our leaders and really kind of look at their actions, which you guys do pretty intensely in the book. You go through our history, starting in the beginning, and you really hold people up to a mirror about their real stances on race. Why is that important to show how complex the issue is, even within somebody who called themselves an anti-racist? We can see through some of their actions, whether it's Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln or Booker T. Washington, that they didn't have it quite perfect. Why is that important to show that?
Because none of us do.
Yeah.
None of us do. I think as someone who has been an assimilationist in certain parts of my life and has been anti-racist in other parts of my life, I think my goal, and I think everyone's goal, what we're trying to promote is, everyone's goal is to always be fighting toward anti-racism and to try to create an anti-racist society, an anti-racist country, and ultimately an anti-racist world. But it does not mean that we aren't human beings. It does not mean that things aren't complex. It does not mean that there aren't extraordinary pressures and nuances to these things. It just means that our job is to constantly be fighting and progressing for the greater good, and that greater good, the greatest of the greater good, is an anti-racist world. You know, and our heroes were no different, you know. And if we respect our heroes like we say we do, then they can't be void of critique.
And I also think we should start from definitions. So, you know, we define a racist idea as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another, and we define an anti-racist idea as any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals. And then we go in search of those two types of ideas. And wherever that search lands us, it lands us, you know. But instead, what people tend to do is they start with their heroes, or they start with themselves, and then they define racism in a way that exonerates themselves and exonerates their heroes. But I don't think we should start. We should start with definitions. And can you imagine if we had common definitions of racism, we had common definitions of anti-racism, and we were honest about what was which? Yeah.
I would say the conversations would be so much more fruitful, because like you said, everybody's just trying to prove that they're not racist. In actuality, if you remember that Broadway play Avenue Q, everyone's a little bit racist, right? Like, if we can just start looking at ourselves and holding up a real mirror, it's important. And I love when you were writing about Obama, because he's, you know, it's a complex role he was in, right? Mm-hmm. And you explain that at some moments he could be kind of embarrassingly assimilationist and then also like so boldly anti-racist. Sure. And the fact that that reality can exist within one person and so much power, I think, is important to note. Yeah. Right?
I mean, not only can it exist within one person, but it can exist within one person over the course of an hour. Yeah. Right? Over the course of a day, right? And all of us. And so, you know, nobody's off limits. Nobody's sort of impervious to assimilationism or to racist ideas. Nobody's impervious to racist ideas. Yeah.
Another theme that's just throughout the book is uplift suasion, which again is an idea that I was familiar with, but I didn't know, I didn't have a vocab word. I didn't have a way to identify what it was. Can you explain what that is and kind of the role you see it playing in our society?
Yeah, I mean, it really began during the decades after the American Revolution, where you had this growing free black population and you had white abolitionists saying, you know what, it's on you by uplifting yourself and acting in a positive manner to persuade away white racist ideas, and those white racist ideas are what's essentially substantiating slavery. So basically it's on black people to convince white people that we are equal. And so that idea has been passed on and even been passed on to children, right? That you have to, black child, act in an upstanding manner to persuade white racist ideas. And if you don't, you're letting down the race. So in other words, the entire race is on your back. And so in other words, you have to be perfect all the time. So in other words, you're not allowed to be human. You're not allowed to make mistakes. But it also says that part of the reason why white people think lesser of black people is because we are indeed acting in a negative way, which essentially suggests there's some truth in notions of racist ideas. And so in a way, this old sort of strategy to undermine racist ideas has been based in racist ideas. So it's not only burdened generations of black people, generations of teenagers, it's also based in racist ideas.
And one way you're able to sort of show how it is insidious, how it gets into our media, was the Cosby Show. So can you talk, were you hesitant at all to address the Cosby Show in that? Because a lot of people love to glorify that it's this great representation of black people, middle-class black people, and blah, blah, blah. But you sort of challenge that and explain how that can actually be like a damaging representation.
I mean, I think ultimately any representation, you know, Langston Hughes had a quote about the idea that black people are both beautiful and ugly, and that is what makes us human. It's okay, right? But the fear of the ugly parts, because the ugly parts will show us in a certain light, and we don't want that to then sort of expound on the stereotypes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it still erases part of our humanity if we don't allow ourselves to be whole. I think the Cosby Show, and all of the things that were positive about it, I think the other bits were that it almost, to me, it made it so that anyone outside of the doctor, lawyer, 5-kid, perfect household where the most complicated thing he'd ever have to experience is how he was going to sleep after eating a hoagie. You know what I mean? And even the concept that the whole show itself, the tagline for the show, secretly was that, does Heathcliff Huxtable ever have time to take a nap? This idea that is his greatest burden in life, is when do I have a moment of free time for me to like rest? The assumption is that the people who are living completely different than that are less than. And it's a fallacy. I think about the show Rock, right? About the garbage man in Baltimore, right? That's also black people, right? That I'm a garbage man. I come home, I do the best I can, take care of my family, and I've got a brother who's got some issues. I got a daddy who lives with me, and we're making this thing work. That's also us, and we shouldn't have to feel small or ashamed that we can be both and. When it comes to our representation and public spaces, our public representation.
And what's also fascinating is when somehow black people are able to be like the Cosbys, in many cases it doesn't undermine white racist ideas. What you have racist whites say is they're extraordinary. So there's not like those ordinary inferior black people, or they're exceptional. Mm-hmm. They're exceptions to the rule of black inferiority. So even if you're able to be subhuman, superhuman, I should say, it still, in many cases, doesn't sort of allow for the undermining of racist ideas. And really, to be anti-racist is to say, yes, you know, there are black people who are lazy, but there are white people who are lazy too. And there's no racial group that has a monopoly on negative or even positive sort of traits.
Do you find then where we are in media to be encouraging? I mean, I sit down with actors and directors every day. A lot of the black women I talk to have voiced that they are having the opportunity to play flawed black women for the first time ever. So are you seeing that shift happening, or is that something that's on your radar?
I'm seeing it, and that's one of, to me, the beauties. I mean, when we are able to allow for complex characters that are black, complex meaning there's a range of positive and negative traits, meaning we're allowing for human, black people to be human, you know, in the media light, you know, to me, that's what we should be striving to be. And so every time I see that complex character, you know, I'm looking at an anti-racist character.
Yeah, I always say, as somebody who creates characters for a living, I always say that our goal is to show human people, right? To show people, right? And that sometimes what happens is we slip into showing characters because we don't understand that characters are actually caricatures of humans, right? They're caricatures of humans. And our job is to put human beings on the page and human beings on the screen.
One person who has a constant presence in the book is Angela Davis. You really use her to sort of navigate basically like 1963 on. You use her to kind of check in. Why was that such an important figure for you to include so often?
I mean, honestly, I think this is something that Ibram should speak to because this was his choice. What I will say is that I also was interested and intrigued when I read the original version and talked to him about it all on a way to think about who we should be looking to, because we haven't been looking to Angela Davis, at least not en masse, right? En masse, we haven't been looking to Angela Davis. But I think the argument that perhaps that's been a huge mistake on our part is unbelievably game-changing for me, having read the original version. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think she's representative of black women more generally, who over the course of American history have really been at the forefront of anti-racist ideas. You know, everyone from someone like Maria Stewart in Boston in the 1830s to Ida B. Wells in the late 1800s and early 1900s to Zora Neale Hurston, who was pushing back against novelists who did not want these complex characters, who felt that the way she was portraying Southern black people in all of their complexities was doing a disservice to the race. And she was responding, no, I'm showing humans, right? To ultimately Angela Davis, who, when other Americans, even other black people, were denigrating black women, she was defending them. When they were denigrating black criminals, she was defending them. When they were denigrating black poor people, she was defending them. When they were denigrating black single mothers in the 80s and 90s, she was defending them. She was constantly saying, you know what, the problem is not these people. The problem is the policies, is the structures, is the power that's sort of ensnaring these people.
When you look throughout history, when you look at all these historical figures, and this is to both of you, we've explained how it's complex to get race right, but who do you see historically who has done it pretty well?
Probably Angela Davis. Yeah. Actually, definitely Angela. Yeah. Definitely Angela Davis. But I also think that we're working to live in a world of progress, not a world of victory. Victory and loss is dangerous to think about that way. Forward movement is sort of where I think we should reside, right? Let's live in a world of forward movement instead of thinking about like how can we win the race conversation or how can we get to the finish line where we can kumbaya ourselves into eternity, right? I just think it's a constant progression, and all of us have to be moving that way constantly and undoing while moving forward, right? Undoing the things that we've learned, unlearning, right? And moving forward.
And I think that's why, you know, one of the characters we sort of touched on before Angela was W.B. Du Bois, who had a massive amounts of movement over the course of his life. And so, in 1903, he talks about the need for the talented 10th to sort of lead the black race, that these people are the most superior African Americans because they've assimilated into white American culture, and it's on them to lead the race. But by 1948, 45 years later, he rejects the talented 10th theory and says, we need a guiding 100th, and indeed the talented 10th is not superior. And so, that speaks to our ability to transform and change, and we have to give people that opportunity.
It's hard sometimes, especially, I unfortunately, like so many people, I didn't learn a lot of this stuff in middle school. It wasn't until college where I had to seek it out. And you get angry that you feel like you've been lied to for so long about a lot of these historical figures who are just lifted up on a pedestal. And you just realize that they haven't really been fighting for you. But then reading this book, I'm like, okay, you have to give people an opportunity to evolve and see the error of their ways. And you did do that for a couple of the people throughout history. You showed their moments later on where they sort of wrote something or said something that was a little more anti-racist.
Of course, but I also think that there's, look, in the midst of the anger, and most people who have read this book feel the same way. I feel angry that I wasn't taught this. I feel angry that I was lied to. I feel angry that now I know my leaders are all flawed. But I think, if anything, it should be empowering to know that while we can be angry at the history of America and race as it pertains to our particular country, I think now it's like, well, now you're armed, right? While we can be upset with these leaders, we could also be them. We could be better versions of them, right? We could be more anti-racist versions of them earlier in our lives, which will make a massive difference in the way our country looks.
And I think that was the point, right? So instead of us learning about this in college, right, or learning about this when we're in our early 30s, we can learn about this when we're 13 years old, right? So we can begin that process at 13 years old, right, which is 10 years earlier than we normally do, right? And so imagine when we're 23, how far we'll be, and thereby imagine how far ahead these 23-year-olds will be able to push this country.
Yeah. How do you remain so hopeful? Because you are a leading scholar in the field of racism. You head up the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University. So this is really something that you are living and breathing and researching and studying. And I would imagine that could be just a weight a lot very often. So what keeps you hopeful that progress can continue to be made?
I think my reading of history, where you've seen the actual unbelievable happen, whether it's 4 million enslaved people in 1860 being freed 5 years later, whether the Haitian Revolution succeeding. And there's so many examples from modern history in which the unbelievable happened, but then there's also a love of humanity, right? When you love someone and that person is sick, you're just not going to give up on that person, right? You're going to want that person, you're going to want humanity to be healed. You're going to want black people to be freed. And then finally, philosophically, I believe you have to believe that change is possible in order to bring it about. Like, that is essential. Like, how are you going to be a change agent if you don't even believe change is possible? So there can be nothing in your sight that allows you to believe that change is going to happen, but you still have to believe in its possibility.
Is that also what inspires you to continue to write? About race, but also just a lot of the other issues that you address for a young adult audience?
I just love kids.
Yeah.
I honestly do. I think it's interesting. This industry is an interesting industry for lots of reasons, but for me, it's always been kids first. And I believe that young people are the antidote to hopelessness. And because of that, my engine continues to rev. Like, my work continues to come forth because I truly believe that young people are the antidote to hopelessness. And I'm fortunate, and I see this as no burden. I see it as a tremendous gift to be able to spend my life around the young folks of this country and the world, because I know the secret, right? And the secret is that they're ready, right? And that they've been ready, and that at some point we all are going to have to serve as lighthouses, and not necessarily as captains of the ship, just lighthouses. As long as they can see us, they'll know which direction to go, but we need not always man the boat. And I think that's what I am certain of because I'm around them so often.
Absolutely. And then continuing to arm them with books like this and with real information and with facts and letting them create the future that a lot of us don't even know how to create, which is so beautiful. So thank you again, both for this book. As I mentioned, I will gift it to several people in hopes that we can continue to have a productive conversation about racism. So guys, Stamped Racism, Antiracism, and You is available today wherever books are sold. And I want to thank Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi for joining us, and we'll see you guys next time on Build Series. Thanks, guys. Thank you.